Good afternoon, Steve Ashby. Could you possibly just introduce yourselves to the boys and girls at home and what your role is here at the University of York?
Yeah, so I'm an archaeologist at the University of York. I'm a senior lecturer here, where I do some teaching. I do a lot of admin, running the teaching, that sort of thing, and I do research. And I'm a Viking archaeologist. I specialise in the early medieval period.
I see. Okay. Now, I really am curious about this. What is a grunge Viking?
A grunge Viking, I think, is someone who's a Viking who has a history of liking grunge.
I see.
So I have a long musical background that I've left behind me, but it's still there in my head somewhere.
Okay. Now this I'm going to just sort of dive straight into this, because actually this is quite a nice segue. Obviously, grunge metal, as it were, or music is well known for its scraggly hair, and you are not necessarily known for your scraggly hair,
or any hair.
Or any hair. Well, I can't talk. But certainly you're known for, in particular, your interest in combs, Viking combs. Now, I could listen to this all day. I love the Viking period. I love evidence of trade and this kind of thing. But what in particular got you into combs? Why combs?
Well, the original way in was through a sort of scientific question, really. I was interested in the question of how the Scandinavians first ended up in the British Isles and when that happened. And there was a long debate about the point at which we first see Scandinavians in Scotland. And one of the pieces of evidence for that was the fact that there were a number of combs which were of Pictish pre-Viking style, which were supposedly made of reindeer antler. There aren't any reindeer in Scotland, so the reindeer antler came from somewhere. So the argument was either Picts have gone to Scandinavia to get some antler, or some Scandinavians arrived here with some antler a long time before when we thought they were here. And they'd arrived presumably on reasonably peaceful terms, because using reindeer antler to make combs is not...
It's hard to, if you're fighting someone, you can't just go, hang on, we can make a comb.
So that was the argument. So it's quite an important question about whether the start of the Viking Age was a long, peaceful affair, or whether it was a much more short, abrupt moment when who were these people coming over the horizon. And it had been said that these combs were made of reindeer antler, but no one had really provided a methodology. So I started getting interested in that.
A methodology to explain where the reindeer comes from.
To identify the difference between reindeer antler versus red deer antler.
Right, yes,
because if you've got a whole antler in front of you, it's quite easy to tell the difference. If you've got a piece of antler which has been turned into an object, and the person who's made that antler, that object, has done everything they possibly can to try to disguise the ugly bits, it makes it quite difficult to tell the difference.
Now, I suppose that act of disguising, I suppose what you're describing there is a composite object, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's the bits coming together with the illusion of a whole at the end. To what extent is this, I suppose, is this act of composition, that's quite pleasing, to what extent is that actually uniform across the Viking world? I mean, do we actually see variations, or indeed is there any consensus on this? I
think the basic template, the idea of getting a number of small pieces of antler, sticking them together, riveting them together into a sort of composite object, that is pretty standard. We see that from the end of the Roman period, and it lasts well into the medieval period in Scandinavia. But within that, there are local variations, and it had been suggested that in the Viking Age itself there was a uniformity right across Europe, and you can see certain elements of uniformity in Scandinavia. But what I found when I was doing my PhD was you can find local variations, sometimes in ornament, sometimes in form, and certainly in the methods of manufacture, where you put the rivets and that sort of thing. Things which we would think about. We would assume that there was a common sense way to make an object. Everything would be made to the most sort of efficient, functional way of doing things, and actually
getting the most per antler. This kind of thing.
Making sure the bits don't fall out when you comb your hair. And actually, what you find is that there are local variations that I'm sure that in each of these different places, the people who made the combs there thought this was the way to make a comb. They weren't making a statement about this is the way I want to make it. No. This was the way you do it. But people a few hundred miles across the North Sea thought about it differently.
Now, I've heard similar conversations surrounding, for example, the design of houses in the Neolithic, or the placement of doors in the Iron Age, this kind of thing, that variation comes through well-meaning copy error, as it were. But to what extent would you say that this variation is copy error, as opposed to potentially the limits of the material? Because, for example, presumably working red deer antler, even though it's similar, won't be the same, and also the variations in the shape and size of these antlers. This variation, is it driven by people just getting it wrong in trying to get it right, or is it actually driven by where they are and what they're working with?
It's a great question. I mean, you can see there's some examples in places like Birka and Sweden where you do seem to have what look like sort of apprentice pieces where they haven't quite got the hang of it, so that's certainly copy error. But you can't see a lot of evidence for that. I think there is an element of sort of the limits of the material making a difference. That's clearly true. You can see the kinds of combs that are made in sort of 10th century Denmark, for instance, and compare them with what they're making in 10th century Dublin or York, and there's a very clear difference, because there's a vague idea of a template, but they basically follow the shape of the tine of an antler. They follow the curve of it, which means that they're irregular and asymmetric. But then I think there's also an element of sort of local variation, which is just based on the environment in which you make something. The idea that apprenticeship and learning comes out of the context in which you work, and partly that's about material, partly it's about the access to the tools you have, the space you're working in, and also who you learned it from.
And would sort of socio-political things come into it? So if for example, the needs of that workshop is to make a certain number of combs in order to pay the rent, then presumably that will have an impact on form as well. You might be rushing them out the door, I guess.
Probably. I mean, we don't know for sure, actually, the mechanism by which these are being exchanged in any real detail. It does seem that it changes, and my guess really is that towards the start of the Viking Age, where we've got a range of quite large ornate combs, but which are quite systematically made and are quite similar across long distances. I think they're probably related to gift exchange. I think they're being produced sometimes on commission, and that's certainly the case with the pre-Viking stuff as well that you see in places like Ireland and Scotland, where you look at two combs and no two of them are the same. They're all different. They've clearly been made for commission, I think. By the time you get into the 10th, 11th century, the world's a bit different, and these are being sold at places like Coppergate. They're being produced for a market, I think. So actually reading ideas like identity into the ornament and the shape is much more difficult, because who's making the choices?
And I suppose that brings us rather, I suppose, almost uncomfortably into modern forces on design, doesn't it? In terms of consensus and why does, I once heard someone say, why does a violin look the way it does? And you go, well, because people wouldn't buy it if it didn't look like a violin. And so I mean, is that a big part of your interest? This sort of push me pull you between form and function?
I think so, and really what the function is I think subject to a lot of my interest. One of the questions is are they anything more than just hygienic implements? For a long time, what people said about combs was that they would say that they can get rid of nits. Vikings had nits, so they had to have combs. And if you look in some towns, they have lots of combs, and people who live in large towns have lots of nits. And it's all a little bit circular, really. If you actually look at these combs, for large numbers of them, the teeth are quite a long way apart, certainly compared to what you're getting in the Roman period or the medieval period, where you think they would actually catch some nits and pull the eggs out. I don't think that's true for a lot of the Viking material. Some of them are very, very large, so they're almost monumental. They must mean something beyond just being for combing your hair. And I don't want to be one of these people who reads really sort of overreads meaning into everything. But these are objects which clearly are being made for some sort of display, and they're very well ornamented. They take a couple of days to make these things. They take a long, protracted way of making them. They don't make them to be thrown away. We find them in graves. We sometimes find multiple examples in graves. We sometimes find examples which seem to be unused in graves. So they have some sort of significance, I think, and I think probably what it's to do with is it comes out of the fact what they're used for. They're to do with grooming, but not just for nits. They're to do with grooming your hair, and we know that in all sorts of modern and medieval societies that one of the ways that people differentiate between classes, the way you totally differentiate the have and the have-nots, is cleanliness and grooming. Look at those dirty people over there, that sort of thing. And
or I can afford to have long hair.
Absolutely.
Because I don't care about the nits.
Yeah. Or I mean, I can afford to spend resources on something like an overly elaborate comb just for the sake of showing off this element of who I am. So I don't think only the aristocrats are combing their hair, certainly, but I think these big ornate things we're seeing, that's making a statement about who I am through the medium of their what they look like. It's almost a sort of there's a sort of Marxist element somewhere there, I think.
So it's kind of like when you hear about these celebrities getting slightly ridiculous gold-plated versions of commercial products like iPhones.
Yeah.
A lot of people can access those, even though they are a sort of luxury item.
Yeah.
But some people get them covered in jewels and gold.
Or a designer watch. You know, it's got a function, but it's showy as well. Now, we don't know that they're being shown off. They're probably being hung from the belt or around the neck and that sort of thing, but they might not have been. They might have been, suspended from hooks in houses. But in some context, they're investing money in the design and the manufacture of these sort of conspicuous items, really.
And presumably, with some of these objects, at certain times, there's an element of consultation as well. What would you like your comb to look like?
Perhaps, yeah.
Okay. Well, we talked for about 10 minutes about combs. Now, I don't want to. I could keep on going, but I don't want to turn too many people off from this. But it's worthwhile looking into, by the way, people. But there are a series of questions which I tend to ask every archaeologist I interview, and the first one, which I think is quite important, is what for you is the most important, enjoyable, funky thing about being an archaeologist?
I think apart from just the pure sort of joy of discovery, which you still get even if you're not really a digging archaeologist. I'm not really a digging archaeologist, but you still get that moment, those eureka moments. It's actually, I enjoy writing, and I like in thinking about what these objects mean and what they can tell us about society in the past and how we might learn from that today. I think that's it's kind of difficult task because objects don't speak to you. It doesn't matter how much you stare at a comb; it doesn't tell you anything. And I don't think it's as simple as trying to make stories up about the past and making sure we don't repeat those errors in the present, as a lot of archaeologists would justify that. I think there's something more subtle there. The process of actually reconstructing how things might have happened in the past is an enjoyable pursuit in itself, and I think that's what I really like. It's not really archaeological detective work; it's kind of story writing. But I think that's to me what's fun and kind of gets me out of bed in the morning.
Okay. In one of my most loathed reading experiences, but I always go back to it because it is a good book. I read Shanks and Tilley's sort of one of their big, well, not big, but important books on theory and practice, this kind of thing. And one of the big points that was pointed out was this relationship between the idea of an archaeologist as being and the idea of a detective as being somehow a Sherlock Holmes type character. And but as you say, there is something more to that which doesn't necessarily have to be fully justified. Because, for example, I remember when I wrote my statement, why do I want to come to this your department to do archaeology or whatever. In there, I said something about exactly what you touched on there, the sense of learning from the past and not repeating the mistakes of the past and the present. But actually, I think something which is even more powerful than that is actually the potential for finding viable alternatives to how we live. Rather than just saying, "Oh, we're on an upwards trajectory and we can actually augment that." Actually saying, "Well, actually, we don't have to even be on this trajectory. Here's something else entirely." That can be really, really satisfying. Okay, so just two more questions to go. What challenges do you think are coming up in the near future for archaeology? What's on the horizon for archaeology?
One of the things that happen at the moment is I think that archaeological science is progressing so quickly. Almost every day we're finding out about new things we can do, things we could do more clearly, we could do better than we could do before. And actually, I don't think we're coming up with the questions at the same rate as the methods are advancing. And so the task really is to keep ahead of the science and to keep aware of the kind of things we want to know. One of the big things I think that's happening in Viking archaeology is the world is starting to be tied up again. We went through a period of thinking in little pockets about Viking England, Viking Scotland, Viking Scandinavia, and then we thought, well, no, it's all one big Viking world in a very sort of general sense. But just now, through things like network analysis, we're starting to get an idea of how that world held together. And the challenge really, I think, is to bring together local studies in these local different sort of areas on a regional scale and see how that works. And that's difficult at the moment because funding doesn't privilege local studies. Funding focuses on looking at things from space. So finding the time and the resources to justify doing a really good detailed study either of a particular region or a site or a particular type of object. I mean, it would be hard to decide to become a comb specialist now, I think. I was lucky I started 15 years ago. It was a lot easier. But I think doing that kind of very specific, very focused work is quite important, and then we have to synthesize it all together.
So being aware of the dimensions that new, especially technologies and new methodologies offer, and how that can be applied to these questions.
Bringing that into sometimes looking at old questions and applying these new methods to them, but also coming up with new questions as well. They're allowing us to answer things we couldn't previously done. I mean, one of the things that I've started working on recently is looking at comb making waste from the Scandinavian towns, and we have large numbers of fragments of throwaway pieces of antler from places like Ribe in Denmark, and now we can tell red deer from reindeer because we have a biomolecular test, so we can identify contact with the Arctic through looking at these scraps of throwaway bits of comb making. No one would have thought to look for that 5 years ago, 10 years ago, because we had no way of doing it. And that's a good example, I think, of the technological abilities we have actually driving us to think in new ways.
Okay, and I suppose finally, what advice would you give to aspiring archaeologists? You've sort of touched there on the fact that it's harder than ever to get into combs, and also, I mean, let me just take a moment just to emphasise, you're not just obsessed with combs. I mean,
no.
you've written a very good book on Viking life in general and this kind of thing. So, but in terms of the possibilities of that research, it's very vital stuff. But nonetheless, you touched on the fact that it's hard to get into that sort of narrow band. What advice would you give to those who want to, whether they want to dip their toe in as an amateur or get full on, PhD and maybe even one day be in this office? What advice would you give?
We don't want to be in this office for start. But I think first things first is to find an interest, and if you're interested in archaeology, that's great. But finding an interest within that is really important. And if you don't know what that is at the moment, then doing an undergraduate degree is a great way of identifying that. Being interested in the past doesn't take it very far, but finding something that you want to answer questions about is a good step. And then once you've got there, then the next step really is to really kind of find a question that needs addressing. So just going in and saying I like combs or I like brooches is not going to get you very far. But I got in there through this question about how the Viking Age began in the British Isles. And if you can find something like that really interests you, and a question which is at least in some degree answerable, that opens up a whole world. You'll end up not just answering that question, you'll answer a whole range of other questions as well. And the journey getting there is quite fun. But you've got to start with that question, understanding why what you want to do is significant, why it's going to matter to someone who doesn't care about combs is quite an important thing, I think.
And presumably, I mean, it sounds a little bit as though you're hinting at least at the fact that being interested will actually help to propel you through that.
Oh, of course, yeah.
But presumably you can't. Well, I'm answering my own question here in so much as I know that you can't make yourself find an interesting topic. It has to be something which you're interested in. And you have to be persistent, and it's very hard to be persistent with something which you're forcing yourself to do. If you can find an area which really kind of sort of lights your fire, whether that's gender in the Viking Age or whether it's Roman economy, whatever it is, something which
which fires your imagination, is going to allow you to find new areas which are interesting and are questions that need addressing. It's quite hard to find the important questions in a topic that you find boring, I think.
Yeah, definitely. That's why I never got into politics. Wonderful. Okay. Well. Yeah, that's been really interesting, and hopefully, we've shown some of the value of combs in so much as I love combs from the Viking era and their distribution. But I suppose there's one more thing, and that is what's next for you. What have you got planned in the near future?
Well, having done combs for 15 years, I've got money for a PhD student who we're going to be interviewing very soon, actually. To basically do the rest of the comb stuff that I haven't done yet, and that's going to be a great project which involves all sorts of scientific research, biomolecular work, to try to identify where different combs are coming from across the Viking world, so we can start to put together the trade networks, the migration, even looking at combs in graves, using them in a kind of the same sort of way we might think about isotopes in teeth. If we can tell where that came from based on whether it's made of reindeer antler or red deer antler or elk, we can maybe have a guess about where the person who's in that grave came from as well. So that's
or at least the connections in their network.
Absolutely, yeah. And so that's combs. The other thing I'm moving on to is very different. I'm just about to start a big funded project to look at cuisine and cooking in the Viking Age. So drilling holes in pottery to try to get the fat residues and the milk residues out of them, so we can see whether different sorts of pottery are being used for different things in different places. So do people in the Scandinavian parts of the country, as far as we can identify that being a real thing, eat and drink in the same way as people in the Saxon parts of the country, and how does that differ to what we see in Scandinavia itself? How does the urban landscape like York and Lincoln differ from what we see in the countryside? How does a monastery differ from the towns? There's been lots of work over the last 50 years really, looking at diet through animal bones, through plant remains, that sort of thing. They ate this much beef, they ate this much lamb, they drank milk, those kind of questions. But actually how they brought it all together, how they cooked, what kind of vessels they use, none of that's all really been looked at kind of synthetically before. So we're going to try and get at that as a way of thinking about identity, actually, as a way of identifying either migrant communities or hybridizations, kind of creolization. Viking archaeologists are obsessed with identity and the idea of the way that material culture and buildings and objects can tell you about the making of a sort of Scandinavian or Anglo-Scandinavian culture. But food is a big part of that as well. You can see that in migrant culture today, and so I want to get a bit of that in the past.
I'll have to come back and talk to you about that.
Okay, that's good. That's probably another video.
I think so. I've got several questions that have come out of that, but I suppose just the first thought that comes to mind though is presumably this would entail. I know you've sort of said this already, but this would sort of entail interrogating whether or not people use the same pot. For example, the equivalent of a teacup might be used in one place for tea and another place as an oil lamp, but it's the same vessel, archaeologically speaking, or typologically speaking. That is very cool. That's very interesting. Okay. Grand. Well, good luck with that, and we'll definitely be coming back, I think. That's very cool stuff. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. And if you are very interested, Steve has, I say that wonderful book. He hasn't asked me to mention this, but I saw it just outside. It is worth looking at. And until next time, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.